Greetings, people of the interwebs. Jake here, and so I saw The Last Jedi at a midnight premiere, and I'd considered doing like a non-spoiler review. By the way, this is going to be non-spoiler. Going to do a full, in-depth, spoiler-heavy review with the rest of the Pasty Pale team. But, anyways, so I'd considered doing a non-spoiler or recording the non-spoiler review like pretty much as soon as I got home from seeing The Last Jedi, but I'm kind of glad I didn't, just because this movie is very different from any other Star Wars movie. And after I came out of the theater, I didn't really know what I thought of the movie. I'm still not 100% sure. Like, I think I still need to watch this movie a couple more times to kind of, for everything to kind of sink in. Just because with any movie, you know, when I saw Force Awakens or Rogue One, or just with a lot of movies in general, when, especially a big movie like this, the initial viewing is all for the spectacle, to see everything on the big screen, and then, you know, rewatching it a second or third time, or however many, times afterwards, that's more of kind of absorbing what is actually going on in this movie. And so I think this is one of the Star Wars movies that definitely would benefit from a second viewing. Because even though as much as I loved Force Awakens and Rogue One, the main reason I rewatched those movies so many times is just because I loved them. I had so much fun watching those movies, watching the characters and all that stuff. Whereas I think this movie is it is definitely one of those movies where I think for someone to accurately and to really kind of give a in-depth, like, just full opinion on this movie, I honestly don't think someone can do it just on their first initial viewing. Like, they can definitely have their thoughts, and they can be like, you know, maybe it's not my favorite of the Star Wars movies, or it is their favorite of the Star Wars movies. I think they can definitely kind of have very generalized opinions on the movie, but I think that to, like, fully understand what was going on in this movie, and to have, like, again, fully fleshed out thoughts and opinions and stuff like that, I think it definitely benefits from having second viewing, at least two viewings. So again, keep in mind that this is still only about 24 hours after my initial viewing of The Last Jedi. So there are definitely a lot of things I think this movie does really well. But then there are also some things that didn't quite land for me. Minor things like the humor. For the most part, the humor for me did not really land at all in this movie. There are definitely some moments that do, but as a whole, there are moments where it didn't. Not to say that, like, it was even bad so much. It's just, I don't know, like, it just didn't work for me. Whereas at least some of the humor, though Force Awakens I think had a little too much at times, I think more of the humor, though, landed for me personally in Force Awakens than in this movie. But again, that's kind of like a minor kind of nitpick thing, more so than like, oh, this will make or break the movie for me. Porgs. Not a fan of porgs. Even though I like the fact that they were not used gratuitously in this movie, which I was kind of afraid of, just because, I don't know, a lot of big budget movies, in particular Star Wars, has kind of been infamous for introducing characters or kind of creatures that it's basically just for marketing. They're kind of like, hey, add these cute little cuddly creatures for marketing, and that's all it is. Like, they serve no purpose story-wise or whatever. That was a lot of people's biggest complaint with Return of the Jedi and the Ewoks, which is fair. I've never really had a big issue with the Ewoks personally, but the Porgs, just not a big fan of. Again, like, they didn't use them gratuitously to the point where, like, they were obnoxious, and I'm like, ugh, why are these things here? But it was still, I don't know, I was just kind of like, they're just there to, like, like, it's still a very blatant marketing ploy where they're just kind of like, yeah, cute little cuddly creatures for plushies and toys because the kids will love them. But again, that's more of a minor nitpick. Didn't make or break the movie for me. This movie takes a lot of risks, and I think here's what will make or break the movie. I think depending on how some of these risks pan out in, say, episode 9, because this movie will be very divided with fans. I think there will be a lot of, like half the fans will really appreciate and love the fact that this movie took a lot of risks, and they're going to be like, yes, cool, change, it's different, I love it, and they're going to embrace that. Then there's going to be the other half where they're going to be like, ooh, yeah, no, no, this is too different, and I don't like it. Because again, that was one of the biggest, a lot of people's biggest complaints about The Force Awakens is it felt too similar to the original trilogy, and that's totally fair. I get that. But for me, it definitely had a lot of shades of the original trilogy, in particular, A New Hope, but there was still enough different things incorporated into the movie to where it felt new and fresh. This movie, there's still definitely elements and shades of the original trilogy, like moments from Return of the Jedi and Empire Strikes Back, but not enough to where it's kind of like it was overwhelming or anything like that. It was just, again, like small moments here and there spread throughout the movie. And I think that really helps kind of complement this movie, because again, it gives you little nuggets of familiarity, but it still is it is very much its own monster. And I think this is going to be one of those movies where, hopefully, because I'm still not 100% sure on, I guess, where I land with this movie. Like, I liked it, but as of right now, I'm not like rushing to go rewatch this movie because I loved it, like I did with Rogue One or The Force Awakens. I mostly want to rewatch this movie to kind of, again, to absorb everything, to really digest everything, and be like, okay, where do I stand with some of the risks that were taken in this movie and some of the changes and the direction that this movie will go. And it could be one of those things where after, another viewing or maybe even a third viewing, I will actually enjoy this movie more. Because I think I've actually I'm a little bit more positive. And again, keep in mind, this is by no means a bad movie. It is not badly made in any shape or form. It's just that, like, again, it's just so drastically different from what I was expecting this movie to be that it just, again, it kind of threw me for a loop, and I'm just still processing everything and be like, okay, am I cool with this? Am I cool with that? And how they handled this and how they... again, like kind of how everything will be going forward with the Star Wars franchise, or at least the episodic movies. And so I think that's kind of where I'm at. Is I'm still trying to process everything, and I think that ultimately, probably the best case scenario is I'll probably still really like this movie, but it'll be more of something where I'm like, okay, I think I appreciate what this movie was trying to do and some of the things that Rian Johnson did in this movie more so than me just straight up being like, yes, I love that, and I could rewatch that over and over again. But again, the thing with this movie is I think the really good scenes they're more subtle compared to any of the other Star Wars movies. Because the other Star Wars movies, even the prequels, though not great movies, there's still moments in those movies where I'm like, okay, that is a great moment. I could rewatch that, just clips of that like on repeat, because they really stand out. They're just these kind of great moments, not just Star Wars moments, but they're good just movie moments. Whereas in The Last Jedi, I think most of the moments are very subtle, where upon my initial viewing when I was sitting there in the theater, I was kind of like, oh, okay, wow, all right. But they didn't land with me in the sense of where I was just like blown away and kind of like, oh my god, I love this scene. It's more of having time to kind of, again, think and process things. I'm like, okay, that was a good scene, or that was a really good moment. They just didn't like kind of pop out to me. Like, again, like moments in Force Awakens or Rogue One where there are just so many moments where I was just like, oh my god, this is amazing, and I could rewatch this movie and these scenes over and over and over again. And I think the subtlety is not like, I don't think that's a bad thing in any way, because I think sometimes subtlety in a way will have more of a lasting impact just because I think it'll be one of those things where like I'll rewatch, like say when this movie comes out on Blu-ray and I rewatch it, I'll be rewatching it because I'm like, okay, these moments are very important, and I think they'll have a lasting impact for the significance more so than because they were just really cool moments or something like that. And so those are some of the things that I think could go either way, though. Like I think a lot of the things that think I don't know. Again, I think sometimes the subtlety though could also be one of the things that kind of turns people off of this movie because there aren't a whole lot of like those like kind of more grandiose, epic kind of standout like a fight scene or something like that. Although there are really some really good fight scenes, in particular the opening space battle I thought was really good. Some of the choreography in some of the more light the fight scenes that involve lightsabers. I'll leave it at that because even though it may not be a direct spoiler or like a huge spoiler, I'm just gonna leave it at that. The fight scene that involves lightsabers, I thought was really well choreographed and definitely one of the highlights of the movie. And that was definitely one of those moments where I was kind of like, oh holy shit, this is amazing. Just that fight scene. So I think the biggest thing with this movie, I guess some of my issues as of now, is certain arcs for characters I think maybe were not executed the best. Not to say that they were bad so much, because there are definitely some important arcs that characters have. I just think that like maybe I would have liked to have seen them done differently and maybe executed a little bit better. And then there's some other like there's a subplot that involves a couple of characters. It was definitely the weakest part of the movie, but it was also one of those things where I think if this subplot had kind of worked out a little bit more towards the end, then it probably would have I would have been a little bit more lenient on this scene. But basically, the subplot ultimately doesn't really contribute much more. Like, it doesn't add a whole lot to this movie aside from having, admittedly, a good character moment for someone, and kind of giving like that's when they really find their purpose. But I feel like outside of that, the subplot doesn't really like I don't want to quite say it's filler or anything like that, but it's one of those things where I just think that like they maybe could have done this. They could have done something a little bit better to maybe give this character their moment of kind of realization, or they just could have executed this same subplot better. Because again, it's one of those things where kind of like in the prequels where there's a lot of good concepts, there's a good story there. It's just, maybe poorly executed. And admittedly, this subplot, I think, if they had spent a little bit more time in this section and what it's dealing with, I think that would have been more fascinating, but it felt a little rushed. But again, with this movie, it is kind of fast-paced in the sense that, like, they don't really deal a whole lot with, like, say, the politics, which is something that I figured this movie actually would. Because after the Republic basically being wiped out, I was under the impression that this movie would deal a little bit more with the political landscape of the Star Wars universe, which it doesn't. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just, I don't think that maybe they could have touched on it a little bit more. And with the subplot, I think it's just something that I think, though not necessary, and again, I'm not entirely knocking it for not spending enough time there. It's just that, like, I guess I would have liked a little bit more time to have spent there and some of the subject matter that it's dealing with. Maybe a little bit more so than the actual subplot itself. But that also being said, I feel like they kind of waste. They definitely waste a certain a specific character with the subplot, and I think they also waste an actor. Now, granted, these characters and actors are probably going to return in episode 9, so it could be one of those things where they kind of make up for their lack of screen time or kind of usage of that particular character in episode 9. But again, as it stands right now, I'm kind of like, you basically glossed over a really cool character that had a lot of rich like lore you could have used there, but instead it's kind of just like, hey, I'm just here to progress the story a little bit further. And then the other character, I think they could have done a little bit more with, but instead it's just kind of, again, more or less one of those things where they're just there to kind of progress the story a little bit further, more so than like that character has a lot more significance. And so those are some of my issues, and then there's another much larger character that I was under the impression we would get a lot more from, and we don't. Like they're kind of they're out of the picture pretty quick, and it's one of those things where like I think the execution of this I keep kind of going back and forth, because one part of me does like that they went for it. They're just like, yeah, you know what? You thought this character would be much bigger, have a lot more importance. Nope, not happening. So I it's commendable. But the other part of me is kind of like, yeah, you know, I like what you did there, but at the same time, I maybe would have liked a little bit more, just to kind of, I don't know, so that way, what happens to this character maybe could have been a little bit more impactful to me personally. So I think that's all, like that's kind of where I am with this movie. Is a lot of the decisions that are made in this movie, I kind of flip-flop back and forth, because I can kind of go either way, where I'm like, okay, maybe I wasn't crazy about how they did that, but it's intriguing, and I think this could make things really interesting going forward. So ultimately, I think with this movie, there are a lot of things that I liked, there are a lot of things that I didn't like. It's a little uneven, but I think going forward, that's where this is where this movie I think could potentially have a huge payoff, and for the people who maybe weren't so crazy about this movie, depending on how episode 9 goes, it could be one of those things where the thing, like what's carried over in episode 9 that maybe people weren't crazy about in 8, but if they're executed well enough, then it could retroactively improve people's opinions on 8. So, like, say, you know, not super crazy about 8, they go see 9. 9 answers some questions. It deals with some of the things that maybe could have been dealt with, or dealt with better in 8. And then they kind of go back and are like, okay, now I see why they did this way. And so, in a way, it kind of sucks that I think my ultimate opinion on this movie all comes down to how episode 9 goes, because that's like a year and a half away, for 2 years. However far away it is. But I do think that like that will definitely be a huge determining factor on my opinions on this movie, is just how some of the storylines and characters go forward into episode 9 and how that's handled. Because here's the thing with the risks taken in this movie. Some of them could be home runs, where, you know, they completely threw us off guard, but like if they do it right, then bam, we'll be like, okay, so yeah, maybe initially I wasn't crazy about how that was done in episode 8, but the way they executed it and kind of brought it to a close in episode 9, perfection. So, but it could also backfire, and maybe like there's a lot of potential they could have had with this, and you know they strike out. So again, that's why I think a lot of this, unfortunately, will come down to episode 9. But again, I think this movie still stands on its own well enough for people. But I'm still very, very curious to see what people's, again, like both hardcore Star Wars fans and just the casual moviegoers. I'll be very curious to see what people think about this movie. Just because, again, changes things up a lot from, I think, what people were expecting. And again, I think what this movie does well is, if you had a fan theory that you were like you came up with on yourself, you were like, oh, I bet this is gonna happen. There's like a 90% chance you're dead wrong. Or if there's a popular fan theory that you're like super into and you're kind of like, oh, that makes a lot of sense, and you go into this movie with that fan theory, again, I don't know, maybe this could be considered a spoiler. Not 100% sure because I don't really know what's going through your head right now. But again, more than likely, whatever fan theory you've got in mind, you're probably dead wrong. So disregard any fan theories, no matter how good they may be or how good they may sound. Don't know how much that affected my opinion going into this movie. Actually, that's maybe something that I can take into consideration, watching this movie for a second time. But yeah, probably just best to go into this movie blank slate. Disregard pretty much everything from fan theories or just whatever expectations you have for this movie. I'm not going to say lower them or have super high expectations. Just go in as a blank slate. I think that's the best way to go into this movie because there's no way you can expect what's going to happen. And again, admittedly, that was very refreshing because there were definitely moments where I'm like, oh, I bet I know that's not what I was. Oh, wow, okay, no, that's not what I was expecting at all. This is different. So, for better or worse, we shall see. But I think this more or less wraps up this review because again, I feel like I can't really go a whole lot more in detail without spoiling anything. And I definitely don't want to spoil anything because this is a movie that you got to go in with a blank. You got to go in fresh. Otherwise, I think that could drastically affect someone's opinions on this movie. So that wraps up this non-spoiler review. Hopefully you will have enjoyed. If you have seen the movie, let me know your thoughts in the comment section without, again, keep it vague, don't spoil anything. Or if you want to, go more in depth and talk more spoiler talk, hit me up on Twitter at IrishmanJake. Then we can go more in depth with spoilers and our thoughts on the movie. Because again, I'm very curious to hear people's thoughts on this. And you can also check out my other podcast that I host on Podbean, Shogun's Gateway to Anime. It's all about anime. Me and my co-host will talk about, rate, review, and recommend different anime series. So I'll leave a link to that for anyone interested in checking that out. And hopefully in the next few days, me and the rest of the Pacey Pill gang will review this movie in full spoilery goodness. So until next time, everyone, cheers.